Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's get started this morning and this afternoon here in the UAE. My name is Danny Seabright, President of the U.S.-UAE Business Council. We could not be more pleased to offer this webinar today on the implications of U.S. elections for domestic and foreign policy with our partner and member, Squire Patton Boggs. On the panel this morning, we will have the Honorable John Boehner, former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives and a Senior Strategic Advisor at Squire Patton Boggs, the Honorable Joe Crowley, former Democratic Congressman from New York's 14th Congressional District and Senior Policy Advisor at Squire Patton Boggs, Ludmilla Kasulke, Senior Associate at Squire Patton Boggs, and Ambassador Frank Wisner, former Senior U.S. Diplomat and International Advisor at Squire Patton Boggs. If we could, I'd like to just make a couple brief opening remarks and then turn it over to the panelists to get started. We're very, very honored to have members of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington on the webinar with us this morning, of which Ambassador Wisner is Chairman, Strategic Advisor, helped start the institution with Ambassador Wahaba, and we really appreciate their partnership and work that we've done together with them. We have guests from the Executive Affairs Authority in Abu Dhabi, from Expo 2020 in Dubai, from the UAE Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, the UAE Vice President and Prime Minister's Office, the UAE Embassy in Washington, D.C., and the UAE Consulate in New York. We have guests from the U.S. Department of State, including diplomats at the U.S. Embassy in Abu Dhabi and the U.S. Consulate in Dubai, from the United Nations. We importantly have representatives from key states in the United States: Alabama, Connecticut, Minnesota, Missouri, New York, Ohio, Utah, Virginia. It's always really important to me to have representatives from our states join our webinars and learn more about the opportunities for business and trade with our very, very important partner and ally, the United Arab Emirates. Finally, we have members of the press from the Financial Times, from Foreign Policy, and Wall Street Journal. This session is on the record, is being recorded, and will be made available to everyone after the webinar if folks were not able to join. With that, I'd like to ask folks if they have a question to use the Q&A function, and I'll try to weave your questions into our format for this very, very rich panel of issues that we plan on discussing this morning, this afternoon. Honorable John Boehner, former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. John Boehner was the 53rd Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, joined Squire Patton Boggs' public policy team in 2016. Speaker Boehner serves as a strategic advisor to the firm's clients in the U.S. and abroad and focuses on global business development. Speaker Boehner, who is from Southern Ohio, led the U.S. House from 2011 to 2015, a time during which he navigated some of the most difficult legislative challenges of the modern era and forged strong relationships with business and government leaders throughout the world. Speaker Boehner, the floor is yours to make your opening remarks. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, Denny, good morning to you and good afternoon to some others. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I have to tell you that my visits to Abu Dhabi and Dubai over the years have always been memorable, both as a member of Congress and as a member of the Squire Patton Boggs team. And so it's really good to be with you and to have this conversation this morning. With regard to the election, I always thought it would be close, as did my colleague Joe Crowley. The polls were wrong in 2016, and what polling doesn't get is they don't actually talk to real people on the ground, neither does the media. And for those of us who have been in the arena, you get a feel for just where the election really stands. And so I thought it would be close. Frankly, it was closer than I thought it would be. And the election is over in everybody's mind except Donald Trump's. But he'll get over this hopefully sooner rather than later. But what was surprising is that while Joe Biden won the election, Republicans appear to at least have a 50-50 shot at controlling the United States Senate. I would argue they've got a little bit better shot than that, given the runoffs in Georgia, where Republicans have won 9 of the last 10 runoffs. But the biggest surprise of the election occurred in the House, where it appears the Republicans are going to pick up around 12 seats narrowing Speaker Pelosi's majority to somewhere around 5 or 6 seats. And so we've got divided government. Frankly, divided government has, I think, served America pretty well. I think the biggest change you'll see in Washington will be the tone. Obviously, Joe Biden has quite a different tone than Donald Trump. And as a result, I think you also see Republicans in Congress spend some time working with the new president. And again, the biggest change you'll see is tone. Yes, there will be some differences in policy, but I think both Republicans and Democrats will be looking for some places to find common ground and get things done on behalf of the American people. With regard to the Middle East, I don't think that President Biden will be as close to Israel as President Trump has been, but I think he'll be closer to Israel than Barack Obama was. And I think Joe Biden understands the importance in the Middle East, the relationship, the long relationship we've had with our friends in the Middle East. And I frankly don't expect that to change much at all. Now, there are others on this call who are a lot closer to this than I am. So I'll let them give their opinions. But it appears clear that the president is likely to rejoin the Paris Accords. He's made statements about Iran and getting back into the agreement with Iran. And frankly, I've kind of got my doubts. He put enough qualifiers around this that I'm not sure that how long that will take, if it ever happens. I think it's mostly a signal to our European friends that he's going to take a little bit different position with regard to Iran than did President Trump. But with that, I'm looking forward to the discussion today and look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Mr. Speaker, thank you so much. And we will get to the Q&A here in a moment. But first, let me introduce the Honorable Joe Crowley, former Democratic Congressman from New York's 14th Congressional District. And as I said before, Senior Policy Advisor at Squire Patton Boggs. Congressman Joe Crowley represented New York's 14th Congressional District, including his hometown of Woodside, Queens, in the U.S. Congress for nearly 20 years. He served in the House Democratic leadership for 6, first as vice chair and then as chairman of the caucus. At Squire Patton Boggs, he provides strategic advice and consulting to clients on a wide range of public policy matters, including tax, financial services, and healthcare. Congressman Crowley, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Danny. Thank you to all my colleagues who are on this call, this Zoom call as well. It's a great honor and privilege to work with them all. But thank you so much for this timely webinar or Zoominar, what do we call them these days? I agree with much of what Speaker Boehner has said. The polls did get it wrong, except that they predicted that Biden would win. But how he would win was completely wrong. He did not win Wisconsin by 17 points. He narrowly squeaked by. But I think what was reestablished here was what was known as the blue wall, really turning the clock on Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Then add to that Georgia, and also that Nevada remained blue, and they turned Arizona. And more specifically, I think you look at just certain cities being Milwaukee, Detroit, Philly, and Atlanta. And as much as the African-American vote was responsible for Joe Biden winning the primary, it also, I think, played a large role in him winning the presidency. And as the speaker also mentioned, how Democrats remained in control of the House of Representatives was not predicted. It was really predicted initially that Democrats would win anywhere between 10 and 15 seats. And in fact, they lost anywhere between 10 and 15 seats at this point. So really a complete reversal of fortune in many respects. And that is yet to be fully played out. There are still a number of seats that are still in contention. One in upstate New York in particular, that is separated by less than 100 votes that is yet to be declared. I think we'll know more this week. So yes, there will be divided government. I think that will temper a great deal of the ambitions of not only the Biden campaign, but I think Democrats writ large, especially the concern that many had in terms of the influence of the left. I do think as we now switch gears and look towards the 2022 elections, that's what happens here immediately. One election's over, you look to the next one. And from a national election standpoint, what also was good fortune for Republicans was that they were very successful in maintaining control of state legislative bodies. And what the speaker knows is that that means that they'll have a heavier hand in determining the makeup of congressional districts going forward in redistricting. Coupling that with the fact that 2022 is the first midterm election of the incumbent president. And historically, the party of the president historically loses seats in the House of Representatives. One important thing to highlight, though, is that there are more Republican Senate seats up for re-election, many of whom are represented by older members of the Senate, including Senator Grassley, for instance. And whether or not they'll actually run for re-election is a question, but there are many, many more. That's double. I think it's double the number of Republican-held seats that are up for re-election in 2022 than Democratic-held Senate seats. As far as it relates to the Biden administration moving forward, and we're in this crazy period of even crazier transition, and the concern that has been expressed really from a national security standpoint, I think we're going to be fine, is my sense right now. But it certainly has raised some kerfuffles in terms of that. We've seen the president-elect announce that from the foreign affairs position that his Secretary of State pick will be Tony Blinken, that the NSC chair will be Jake Sullivan, and that the UN representative will be Linda Thomas Greenfield. All have had tremendous international experience, and I think our good friend Frank Wisner can expound upon more of those and the importance of those positionings. But I do think that this administration will be the exact opposite in terms of the Trump administration, which was much more of an isolationist administration. I think you're going to see the reestablishment of traditional allies, particularly in Europe and our NATO partners. I think some of the initial things you'll see happen, I think, is that the Biden administration will rejoin the Paris Accords and make efforts in that vein. The WHO, the World Health Organization, and I do believe that that there is ownership by the Obama-Biden team that now moves into a Biden-Harris team of the Iran deal. So some aspect of that. And so, Joe Biden was the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, Foreign Affairs in the House, Foreign Relations in the Senate. So these are issues that he's always had a hand in and always, I think, played a major role in. So I would expect no less in terms of his presidency. So with that, I know there's much more to talk about in terms of arms sales and the peace process in the Middle East, Abraham Accords, et cetera, but I'd be happy to answer questions as directed. So I'll turn it back to you, Danny.
Congressman Crowley, thank you so much for your opening remarks. Let's give Mila Kasulke a chance to say a few words. Mila provides multinational corporations and sovereign governments and entities with advice on a wide range of trade policy, legal, and regulatory issues. She also regularly counsels clients on the impacts of current and potential new trade negotiations, including the US-Mexico-Canada agreement and US-Japan and EU talks. Mila, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Danny. Everyone, I can tell you that the last 4 years have been marked by a lot of things, but in trade, it's been a whirlwind. And I think The policies have all been under this theme of America First, and we've seen efforts to counter perceived unfair trade practices, a focus on fair, not free trade, and aimed at balancing trade relationships and reciprocal benefits. And finally, a lot of wielding executive authorities to achieve policy goals, sometimes unrelated, so using trade to achieve another goal. So what do we expect in a Biden administration? Speaking broadly, as Congressman Crowley was indicating, we expect a return to multilateralism and diplomacy and an emphasis on rebuilding relations with key allies. But while we expect changes in trade, don't expect to see on day one all these tariff programs rolled back. With the COVID pandemic and the economy the way it is, the administration is going to be focused in other areas first, but those discussions are certainly ongoing. And while we're expecting some change, we're not expecting a complete 180 shift to the other direction. So there are three areas that have really been the big buckets. There's China, there are tariffs, and then I want to end a little bit on sanctions as a segue to Ambassador Wisner. So with China, we've seen a max pressure campaign. We've seen sort of all corners of the government coming together and seeking to put pressure on China on a variety of topics. We know 5G has been a major focus for diplomatic outreach. We've got technology transfer and a big focus in recent months, especially on human rights and the policies towards Hong Kong. And this is part of a global campaign. It's certainly a major focus of President Trump's, and we've got 6-7 weeks left and expecting that to be a major focus of the last few weeks. Constant reports coming of what could be coming, including executive actions. In recent weeks, we saw the administration take actions targeting China's policies in Hong Kong and then targeting securities transactions of certain designated companies. So what's coming next under a Biden administration? Overall, the pressure is going to continue. Too much has changed in the last few years to really expect a complete return to pre-2017. And, you know, President-elect Biden is going to have a Congress to deal with, and the U.S. Congress is eager to show that it is tough on China, both Republicans and Democrats. And there are a number of proposals that were put out in the last few weeks that could certainly be refiled and advanced in the new Congress, especially among Republicans. Republicans are very eager to outflank each other on being tough and taking that position, leading into potentially challenging President-elect Biden in 4 years. And I look forward, I know this is a major area of focus, so we look forward to discussing this more in the discussion section. Under tariffs, we've seen an unprecedented number of executive actions on tariffs. And these were all done under authorities that Congress gave the presidency, the office of the president, over many years and over many decades ago. So these are statutes that in many ways are being used in ways that were not originally envisioned. And it's raised a lot of questions in Washington. For the most part, the biggest focus has been in two programs. There have been the tariffs on a vast majority of trade and goods with China, and also the tariffs of steel and aluminum imports into the United States. Again, we do not expect to see those tariffs dismantled on January 21st, but we do think that with time, you could start to see some effort to roll them back. There is some domestic support for aspects of these programs as they exist, but there is room to roll them back. For example, with the steel and aluminum tariffs, certain countries are currently exempted from those. You could see the Biden administration expand the universe of countries that are eligible for those exemptions and try to focus where the original effort was, and that was really on the oversupply of steel and aluminum from China. And then in terms of the China tariffs, there are legal challenges ongoing that could have impacts on the programs. And overall, you could see just a wider net of exclusions granted. So if you're involved in China trade, really want to be looking to see how the Biden administration may want to tailor those programs to his policy goals. And finally, just to end on a quick note with sanctions and specifically Iran sanctions, the Trump administration has certainly exerted a maximum pressure campaign on Iran, withdrawing from the JCPOA and reimposing a number of harsh sanctions. Biden has previously pledged to offer Tehran a credible path back to diplomacy and said that he would return the US to the deal if Iran returns to strict compliance with the nuclear deal. And while, as we were discussing, while Europe is eager to see the U.S. re-enter the pact, there will be political and legal challenges to that. And would just note that Democrats in Congress have signaled that it won't be enough for the nuclear for Iran to comply with the terms of the nuclear deal, that they would want to see more on limits to the country's missile program and support for proxies in the region to be open to those sorts of discussions again. So that's very top line, and looking forward to discussing it more.
Mila, thank you so much. You have a lot there, and we have some stuff to unpack in the discussion for sure. But at this moment, I'd like to introduce Ambassador Frank Wisner, former senior U.S. diplomat and international affairs advisor at Squire Patton Boggs. Ambassador Frank Wisner's diplomatic career spans 4 decades and 8 American presidents. He served as ambassador to Zambia, Egypt, the Philippines, and India during his extensive career in the State Department. At Squire Patton Boggs, Ambassador Wisner provides clients with strategic global advice concerning business, politics, and international law from the firm's Washington, D.C. and New York offices. And if I could humbly say, Ambassador Wisner, you've also been a mentor to me over the last 25 years, from the time we did things together with the Cohen Group in India, all of the Middle East work. Thank you, thank you, thank you for all that you've done. Really appreciate it. The floor is yours.
Danny, that's a very generous introduction. I thank you. I'm very pleased to be with you and with your membership and guests, and to be part of the Squire Patton Boggs team this morning. John Boehner and Joe and Ludmilla, all of whom have spoken to you. My remarks will be focused a bit more sharply on the relationship with the UAE, because I believe as we head into a Biden administration, there are going to be a number of challenges. I have 3 in particular. The first is the tone of the relationship, the overhang of the proximity that many on the Democratic side of the House see was the case between President Trump and his administration and the nations of the Gulf. There are particularly strong feelings in our Congress and in the body politic about Saudi Arabia. And while the UAE is certainly not Saudi Arabia, it is not entirely disassociated from the image issues that we have faced in the last couple of years. The second major challenge will be, as Ludmilla correctly pointed out, Iran. It is a determination on the part of Joe Biden and his team to reassociate the United States with the JCPOA for 3 really powerful reasons. First, the nuclear problem is getting worse. Iran is increasing its holdings of high enriched uranium, and that's a direct threat to the interests of the United States, our allies. It is a subject of profound concern. It's why the JCPOA existed in the first place. The second reason is that we're sitting on a powder keg in the region with American forces, Iran and Iranian proxies, our friends in the Gulf, all lined at hair trigger distance. And it wouldn't take much for there to be a problem. We've got to get from a military posture back into a political one where the issues can be addressed without them blowing us all up. And third, critical to the United States thinking and Biden's thinking is our relationship with our allies, who look at the JCPOA and Iran as literally a critically important issue as far as they're concerned. And they expect and want the United States to be back in line with Britain, France, Germany, not to mention, of course, the 2 other JCPOA powers. So the Iran issue is the second. The third that we have to face is the challenges to our security relationship, the security relationship between the United States and the UAE. And that's tangibly defined these days, as all of you know, by an arms supply arrangement, and particularly before our Congress, the acquisition of 50 F-35s, air-to-air missiles, and Reaper remotely piloted aircrafts. There is concern in our Congress, and it's substantial. There are some who argue Israel's qualitative edge. There are others who have concerns about security policies pursued in recent years by the UAE. There's a challenge already on the floor. Two measures of disapproval have risen. In my own judgment, we will probably make our way through. And while passage through the Congress will not be easy, I'm reasonably confident it could happen, and thereafter that the deal would be executed. Of course, any deal passed even by our Congress can always be changed in the future, but I personally think a new administration will have less reason to change it than might appear to be the case otherwise. So if I turn now and take a step back with all of you and look at the United States and the UAE, I deeply believe that for reasons of strategic interest and practical foreign policy, I'm a reasonable optimist that our relations with the UAE will weather the roiled waters of transition in Washington. After all, think about it for a moment. The Middle East is reasserting itself as a center of global power competition and adjustment. Russia, China, Iran, Turkey are all at play. And the United States simply cannot, on due reflection, be absent or surrender the leverage of its longstanding relationships. And of that mix of the region, the Gulf is the key point in regional rivalry. Our relations with the UAE stand us in particularly good stead, for the United States enjoys probably the broadest relationship with the UAE that it enjoys with any party in the Middle East. So too is Saudi Arabia important, but that issue is slightly more complex. It's not only the broad, direct bilateral relationship, but we and the UAE have vitally important interests in our security ties, our intelligence connections. We are your largest, UAE is our largest regional trading partner. But think for a moment about Syria, Iraq, Libya, all of where the United States has a critically important level of cooperation it needs in its relations with the UAE. There is Iran. Iran is of huge existential importance to the region. And frankly, I don't see how you can sell or complete an agreement on the JCPOA, much less an ongoing relationship, unless there is tolerance from the Gulf and from the UAE. So when we look around the area, it's impossible for us to address Yemen or Libya without the UAE, nor can the Qatar problem be untied without the participation of the UAE. Finally, it's worth underscoring the role that the Abraham Accords have played. They have gone a long ways to enhance the UAE's reputation. It's added an element in the region's balance of power. But if you think about it politically in American terms, the Abraham Accords have buried an intra-Democratic Party quarrel over relations with Israel. This has been of enormous importance. So as I stand back again, I am a cautious optimist. I recognize that there are hurdles ahead. I recognize these have to be cleared, but I have great confidence in the realism, judgment, and experience of Joe Biden and his team. And I have high confidence in the sophistication of the leadership of the UAE, which knows us well and which recognizes the importance of the American relationship. When you look at Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, not to mention a number of others on the Biden team, these are all people who can spell the UAE literally backwards. So I do, to repeat myself, I'm absolutely convinced that I start out cautiously optimistic about the relationship. Let me make one final point, Danny. with your indulgence, and that is, I'm now speaking personally. I'm not reflecting my assessment of administration, the future administration's policy, but I do not believe the United States can accomplish a key objective, return to the JCPOA, without a measure of understanding and agreement from our friends in the Gulf. And we can't get that if the United States doesn't make it clear under a Biden administration that we're not going to make the same mistakes that were made during the Obama period, that we're going to respect the sovereignty and the political institutions of the nations of the Gulf. We're going to defend our robust security ties. We're not going to move forward without close consultation. And we're going to have to set very high goals on where we want to go with Iran, not as preconditions, but the outcome, the control of Iran's proxies and intrusions in the region, the military balance. Even if we have a lot of work to do, that has to be a common objective. So finally, I'd like to think that the United States needs to show some sympathy and sentiment towards the UAE with regard to rebuilding the strength of the Arab state system. The lack of Arab agency in these crises of the moment is telling, undermines our ability to defend our interests and of the Gulf to achieve, and the UAE to achieve security. Danny, let me stop there and turn the floor back over to you.
Ambassador Wisner, thank you so much, and really a lot to follow up on. I want to underscore one point that you just made before I turn to Speaker Boehner, and that is, I just returned from a week in the UAE, in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. I had the opportunity to meet with a number of senior folks and consult on current feelings and perceptions. And this was my first trip in literally 9 months. And I will say to you, on the JCPOA and the UAE's role, the Arab role in the future, the Israeli role in the future, we can't make the mistake that we made in the past and not have our friends at the table, nearby the table, in the next room from the table. They have to be consulted from the beginning. They have to be included from the beginning. And this is a point that I've made to my friends on the Biden team, the Biden transition team. We can't make that mistake again. We have to include them from the get-go. So with that, if I could, Speaker Boehner and Congressman Crowley, the blue wall. Yes, the blue wall was reestablished, but the blue wave never happened. And I waited anxiously on election day and then the next day for some sign of the blue wave to happen, so that we would have some sense that there was a majority opinion here. And what happened, in fact, instead, was we're split right down the middle on almost all of the issues, and on tone and civility and trying to work together. Can the Biden team and the new Congress create a new tone in Washington? And Speaker Boehner, I know you spoke a little bit about it, but can I push you to say a little bit more? Can we get to a place in Washington again where the two parties can come together and get some work done?
Well, you know, a lot of what happens in Congress happens on a bipartisan basis, but the American media never cover that. They only cover Congress when they're at each other's throats. And so people have this a rather jaundiced view of how partisan things really are, when frankly, they're not quite that partisan. Secondly, I would point out that Republicans understand how Washington looks to the American people, as does Joe Biden. And I think both parties want to show the American people that they can get along once in a while. And so I think early on, you're going to see the Republicans in Congress work with the Biden administration. I think by and large, Biden's cabinet picks are going to be approved by the Republican Senate. I think that you'll find a couple of policy issues, whether it's a COVID relief bill or an infrastructure bill, that will be done on a bipartisan basis, because I think both parties want to demonstrate to the American people that they can, in fact, work together. And lastly, I'll say this. Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell have a long relationship. I was in the middle of this relationship for 5 years during the Obama administration when Obama wasn't the best negotiator. So he sent Joe Biden up to the Hill to negotiate with McConnell and myself. And Joe's a guy who likes to get things done. He and McConnell have a nice relationship. They respect each other. And so I think it'd be more than just tone, and it'd be more than just pictures. I actually think there's going to be some effort at repairing the damage that's been done over some time.
Well, that's really wonderful to hear, sir, and appreciate it very, very much. Do you think the next 60 days are going to create more problems for that to happen with the new president and the new Congress, or are we going to be okay in the next 60 days?
I think virtually everybody in Washington, other than one, has already looked past those 60 days. And at some point, the president will get over this and get on with it. But most Republicans in Washington have already looked beyond it. I wouldn't worry about much over the next 60 days.
Thank you again. Congressman Crowley, do you want to comment from your side of the aisle on what I just asked the speaker?
Well, I think I agree with much of what the Speaker Boehner has just said, especially the point that he made about his own experience in terms of the relationship between President-elect Biden and Mitch McConnell. I do think that I take Joe Biden at his word 2 weeks ago when he was recognized as the presumptive president, that he wants to heal the wounds of our nation. I believe that. I think he recognizes that 70+ million Americans voted for his opponent. And as John Boehner has pointed out before, President Trump received more votes in a presidential election in the history of the United States, with the exception of Joe Biden, who received 6 to 7 million more votes than this president. So look, the American people are divided in many respects. That's not unusual. The percentage of the difference in terms of the tally are very similar to other elections that we've most recently been through. What I do think is a bit different here in terms of this transition, there was really a rush deliberately to pass domestic policy and even international policy within the next 60 days, and I think has people concerned. There's already discussion in terms of the rollback on the executive orders that Joe Biden will do on day one, much of it in regards to environment, labor law. I think the concern you see in the UAE in terms of the notification to Congress that was made earlier this month on the arms deal was really more, I think, there were some, isolationists within the Senate who are concerned about our foreign policy writ large, but it's really about this transition period with the new president coming in to allow for the next president to be more on hand in terms of the deals that were made and moving forward, giving his team an opportunity to come together to be involved in some of that decision making. So that's the sense I have. I do think that to answer your initial question, I do think Biden is sincere and wanted to make that happen. I do think COVID is job one, crushing it or at least getting it under control, where there are a lot of advancements that have been made. And I think Speaker Boehner is correct as well, that I think infrastructure is an issue that the Congress has traditionally had a bipartisan approach to, which could help, I think, heal some of the wounds within the Congress itself. So that's my sense.
Thank you, Congressman. Speaker Boehner, just a quick two-finger on the Paris Accords. I understand COVID is job 1, 2, and 3, in my opinion. And also you mentioned the infrastructure, but how will the new Congress, especially the Republicans, respond to Biden's approach on rejoining the Paris Accords? And in fact, this is an area where the UAE has great interest in being a partner to the new team.
Well, I think the Republicans in Congress will just shrug. Okay, fine. Another international organization means well, but it doesn't mean doesn't mean much in terms of votes in the next election.
Okay, there will be real things that the U.S. will need to commit to at some point. But I take your point. For the next election, we might not be there yet. So that's a very fair point. So let's move right to the big elephant in the room, if I could say that from my standpoint, and that is the arms sales package from a congressional standpoint. Ambassador Wisner spoke about it from a foreign policy standpoint, but from a congressional approval standpoint, is Congress on board the way these informal and then formal notifications were made? Is Congress on board with the Israeli statements of acquiescence that it's okay, that it doesn't harm their qualitative military edge going forward? How does this play out in this Congress and the next Congress, Speaker Boehner and Congressman Crowley, from your standpoint as experts on Congress, of course?
Well, Denny, don't underestimate the UAE's ambassador to the U.S. Yusuf has done frankly, as good a job as any ambassador I dealt with over the last 25 years in terms of his outreach to both Democrats and Republicans, and not just outreach. I mean, the ambassador has developed some very close relationships in both the House and the Senate. And I think at the end of the day, these will pay big dividends in terms of the Congress being a problem, which frankly, I do not expect they will be a problem, not at all. There you have a couple of grandstanders on both sides of the aisle, but don't read too much into it.
Thank you, sir. Congressman Crowley?
Yeah, I would just add to that, as I kind of mentioned earlier in my remarks about the deal itself. And I think just that we're in this transition period that would give some sense of pause to allow the new administration to catch up and to get its legs underway. Let me also just state, Danny, that I don't speak on behalf of the Biden future administration at this point. These are just strictly observations, though I belong to his party, and I'm happy that they've won. I want to make it clear to all our listeners that I'm not giving the Biden side to this per se, but just give my observations in terms of the timing of the notification to Congress that happened after the election had taken place and was already suspect that Joe Biden would be the next president, not President Trump. That the Congress, I think, would some degree ask for a slowdown so that the new administration could have more of an input here, is my sense. And I would leave it to Ambassador Wisner maybe to comment on that as well.
So with the Abraham Accords, gentlemen and lady, we've made peace between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain, for that matter. And Ambassador Wisner, you spoke about putting this behind us within the Democratic Party, this division. Are we going to put it behind us in Congress? Is there going to be recognition that now that Israel and the UAE are at peace and they've restored normal relations, that moving forward in some of these defense packages and sales should not be nearly as big as an issue? I'd like to hear your thoughts on all that.
Well, I believe I happen to be a great supporter of the Abraham Accords and think this is a stroke of political genius on the part of the UAE to have forged ahead against the perception of other Arab opposition and opened the door to a balancing of, opened the door to Israel increasing its relationships as a part of the family of nations of the region. So hats off. That said, I believe it is highly important in terms of the UAE's image in Washington and in the Congress. Had there been no Abraham Accord agreement, I think the sale of the military equipment that we've been talking about would have been much, much more complicated. The Abraham Accords changed that, and it changed it for, as you correctly reminded me, for the reason I cited, and that is the issue not only appealed to Republicans in the administration, but it appealed to Nancy Pelosi, for it made it possible for her to signal to the raucous backbenchers in the Democratic family that Israel and the Arabs were finding ways to live with one another. This is highly important. There will be other challenges from the Democratic left, but I think they've been largely contained. And finally, in terms of the region itself, the fact that Israel is now in a political relationship with the UAE, Bahrain, I understand the Prime Minister of Israel and the Saudis are going to be meeting shortly. That change is really strategically important. It not only brings Israel into the region, but it sends a signal to Iran and any others that there is an emerging capability to resist politically the destructive events of these recent years. And that's a huge strategic departure. And I take my hat off to the leadership in Abu Dhabi and in the UAE for having forged this path forward.
Thank you, Ambassador. Before we pivot to a little bit of a discussion about China with Mila, I want to ask one quick question about Saudi Arabia. Prime Minister Netanyahu was in Saudi Arabia overnight to meet with the Crown Prince at Neom on the Red Sea. This is the first ever visit that we know of by an Israeli Prime Minister. When the Saudis step forward and are ready to sign their own Abraham Accord agreement with Israel, how much are they out of the quote unquote doghouse back in the US or not? With Congress, with the new administration, does this take some pressure off or not? Real quick answer, please. From Speaker Boehner, Congressman Crowley, and then Ambassador Wisner, if you will.
Oh, I think it takes some pressure off. Not all of it, but certainly a big step in the right direction.
I agree.
Okay.
Yes, do I.
Okay, thank you so much. Mila, China. I can tell you, and I know you know well, I'm just on my recent trip, China is the conversation being had behind the scenes in all of our engagements with our friends in the Gulf regarding which path do you go down, a US pro-West path or increasingly a path towards closer cooperation with China. What can you say to us about how the Biden team and the new Congress will approach this discussion?
So I think, and my colleagues have spoken on this and can elaborate further, we see the China relationship, the Biden team taking the China relationship with the three broad categories. We will compete with China. We will confront China, but when we can, we will cooperate with China. I think the central theme to all of this, Ambassador Wisner, thank you. The central theme of all of this, though, is that there's going to be a more centrally focused China policy. Actions that are taken by the administration will be aimed at achieving goals in a much more broader sense. It does feel like right now it's maximum pressure from all sides. But to give the administration some credit, there are many on both sides of the aisle that feel that for many years and across both Republican and Democrat administrations, what the United States had been doing to confront China and to address perceived unfair trade practices and different other policy goals that China had been seeking, it wasn't working. And so things like the Section 301 investigation, when it was first launched, were seen as sort of this refreshing first step. Now, as the investigation went on and additional lists of goods were targeted for tariffs, it looked like there was a bit of a spread. You know, there were tariffs being put in place for things that weren't technically trade practices. And so that's been a challenge. And so I do think that there will be just a general, and I welcome my colleagues chiming in as well, you know, there will be a general return to multilateralism, working with the Europeans, working with our allies, specifically in the Pacific region to respond to China. But there isn't going to be a snap of the fingers and things are back to normal. Things that Republicans and Democrats are concerned about the transfer of certain strategic technologies and military technologies, issues like human rights and labor practices. While those issues may have traditionally been the charge led by Democrats with Republican support, the Trump administration has taken a lot of these labor concerns and put them in through the lens of trade. And so right now, things like forced labor, those are human rights challenges, but they are also unfair trading practices. They lead to, labor violations or human rights violations that lead to cheaper goods that are competing against US products on the world stage. So when you see the Trump administration, which has been as aggressive on forced labor as any others when it comes to our trade laws, targeting goods made with forced labor, it's couched in both. It is a human rights violation, but it is putting the US at a trade disadvantage. And so as President-elect Biden is crafting his China policy, he is going to have to work closely with Congress. And I think that the Democrats in Congress will be the best able to help temper what Congress does to make sure that it aligns with the president-elect's broader China policies, because otherwise there are a lot of policies being introduced in Congress just across the range that could hamper maybe his broader goals.
So for our Gulf friends, China is going to be just as important in the new administration and getting it right with our Gulf friends, if you will. But we're going to come at it, as I think Ambassador Wisner and others have said, in a little bit of a different direction. But it's going to be nonetheless just as important for our friends there. So Mila, say a few words about other trade priorities for the Biden team and for that matter, the 117th Congress coming up.
Definitely. It's actually a pretty big year for trade policy when it comes to legislation. We have a lot of major programs that are set to expire. At the end of this year, we have the miscellaneous tariff bill and the generalized system of preferences, which are two programs that reduce or eliminate tariffs on imports from certain countries and for certain goods. We've got trade adjustment assistance that provides support to Americans whose jobs may have been displaced because of trade. But the big one that we have coming up is Trade Promotion Authority. That is the legislation that helps provide some fast track procedures for considering trade agreements. We could go back and forth on how it is actually used in the US. But the important thing is it is extremely complicated to renew because the law itself contains Congress's priorities for trade agreements. And so every time that the TPA is, as we call it, comes up, it starts this really big discussion about broader trade goals. And it ends up being this moving vehicle when it comes to trade. And that expires in July. And so it will be up to the Biden administration to sort of decide whether TPA is a priority for it, because it is a fight, as Speaker Boehner and Congressman Crowley can speak to from experience given the last few renewals. We've had a lot of discussion in the past few years about whether Congress should be reasserting some of its leadership in these trade areas that it had granted to the president. Again, these are authorities that Congress gave the president to under Section 232, enact tariffs on goods that impact national security. Under Section 301, conduct these trade investigations to target unfair trade practices impacting U.S. entities. But in the last 4 years, the Congress hasn't really done anything. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Politically very challenging. These programs have supporters and detractors. And so you can imagine how within Congress, there's a lot of debate about whether these policies are good or bad. But I have heard from some sources as well that Democrats see that some Democrats at least have seen that President Trump has sort of opened the box in how these trade authorities are used. And at least several years ago, when we didn't really know who the Democratic candidate would be, and now the president-elect, wanting to leave that authority open to the president. So it'll be sort of interesting to see how the Congress looks at it now. I mean, there have been some rumblings about different ways that tariff programs could be used early on, 3.5 years ago, even whether a Democratic president would want to use Section 232 to go after climate change and using trade as a tool to enact climate policy, as we know climate's going to be a major priority for the administration coming in. So I think it'll be really interesting sort of to see how those priorities come together. And overall, when we're talking about multilateralism and I think especially with regards to the EU, the administration is going to be focused on sort of rebuilding the relationship. You know, US-EU trade is a really major example of bilateral relations that have soured over the last 4 years. So there are some major issues there as well to start to, you know, soften things with people who traditionally been our allies for many years.
Mila, thank you, and especially for pointing out those things that are going to expire in the next number of months. I think that's really important for our viewers to take note of. Ambassador Wisner, we have about 5 minutes left, and I want to turn it to you if in sort of a wrap up. You know, there's a couple things that haven't been said at all yet in this presentation today. We haven't mentioned the Palestinians in any way, and we talked about the Abraham Accords, of course, which one reason for them coming to being is the situation with the Palestinians and Israel. But say a few words about that. Say a few words about the future relationships with Turkey, Libya, and Yemen from a Biden administration, please.
Well, you've opened up a huge number of subjects. Let me see if I can do justice in the few minutes we have, Danny. First of all, the Palestinian question. Let's be honest with one another. Two realities that have to be addressed. One reality is that Israel is a constituent part of the Middle East. Its interest and presence needs to be taken into account. And the UAE has seen that. The decision to extend a hand of recognition is an important part of adjusting a long-standing missing element in the realities of the region. So, dead right. But the other reality is that the Palestinian problem is a real and enduring problem. Israel stands in occupation of an enormous population that is not going to settle down easily. All of the schemes that have been discussed have not worked. And yes, I recognize the contribution the UAE played by perhaps staying Israel's hand a bit in further annexation, but I also recognize that that does not solve the Palestinian problem. To deal with the Palestinian problem, you need two parties. You need Israel and you need the Palestinians. At the moment, the Palestinians are obdurate and difficult and extremely weak with a confused political situation of their own. And Israel has its own internal problems. That means neither side is really equipped to face the other and reach an agreement. And I don't care what the United States, the UAE, or anybody else does, if the core parties don't play, you can't get a deal. So now we come back to what's going to happen. I do not believe that the Israel-Palestinian peace process, as I knew it and lived with it for decades, is going to be a top item on the part of a Biden administration, precisely because the parties aren't ready themselves. There isn't a role for us to play. We'll be a friend and looking for ways to be of help, but we cannot superimpose ourselves, nor can the UAE, on the parties themselves. Further evolution politically in both is necessary. Second, Turkey is a major factor, strategic factor for the UAE. I fully understand that. Turkish truculence in the Gulf, in Syria, in the Eastern Mediterranean, now down the coast of East Africa, Turkish intrusions into the Arab space are a real matter of concern to the UAE and to the United States. But the question is how to deal with them. And I believe that the best way to deal with the Turks is politically and not to try to do it alone. The United States needs to be clear where our red lines are with Turkey, and then to approach our European allies. Turkey cannot exist alone in the world. And I think Erdogan feels he can get away when we're divided. What we need to do is come together and send a consistent set of signals that we're not going to accept a new definition of the seabed in the Eastern Mediterranean, nor Turkish sustained intrusions in Libya, nor a perpetual occupation of northern Syria. These things make it impossible. And when Turkey comes and looks to the rest of us for help in its economics, which are fragile, and in its political relationship, if it doesn't have a basis, it won't be able to move forward. So I think we have substantial leverage, but we have to mobilize that leverage. Libya, finally, daunting, as is Yemen. Yemen cries out for a quicker solution. I believe the Iranians wouldn't mind seeing a Yemen settlement. The UAE has struck a slightly different pose. The signals out of Saudi Arabia are positive. There is a UN mission, Mr. Griffith's mission, which provides a focal point. I think there is possibility of seeing progress on the Yemen front. And while it won't be the first line of argument in a Biden administration, there will be support for it. Libya, more complicated. The two sides of the Libyan civil war are almost equally poised, and trying to overcome that difference isn't going to be easy. The UN vehicle and coming together to nudge the parties to some collaborative, cooperative formula for dealing with Benghazi and Tripoli is the task before us. It isn't going to come easy, but it is an important issue for the United States and the UAE. For UAE's own role in the Libya problem is watched in this country and does have an effect on our perception. And we want to see this civil war calm down. UAE can play a role in helping do that.
Having just spoken, sir, with some folks from the transition yesterday, your last point about how that the UAE is watched in Libya is very, very accurate and certain for sure. The folks this does matter, and we have to think about that. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to, we've come to the conclusion. I want to say thank you again to Kathy Norman and to Squire Patton Boggs. Kathy is in the Washington office, and it was Kathy's idea to do this event. We couldn't be more pleased with the partnership and to highlight one of our member law firms. We have many others, and I know I'm going to have requests to do this with some of our other law firms after this one, but Ambassador Wisner, Congressman Crowley, Mila, and especially Speaker John Boehner, thank you so much for being with us today and for joining us and providing your perspectives. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you again.
Thank you, Danny.
Thanks, Danny.
Bye-bye.